Okay, that was a good start.
Hi, guys. This is Syncromystic Episode 3. I'm Wayne McRoy. This is Richard Willett. And today we're going to break down the philosophy of fire, looking at the things going on in the world today. It would appear Hollywood's on fire, so there's a lot of interesting things happening in the world. How are you today, Richard?
I'm good, thank you. I'm really looking forward to this one because I know you know a lot about this. I was listening to one of your shows that you did about the philosophers of fire. We know that this is one of the, well, 5 elements, but they sort of whittle it down to 4 elements and get rid of the ether, obviously. And it's all kind of goes into the Star of David, if you want to call it that. Many other names for this thing, but obviously the earth, wind, fire, and water, but ether is in there as well, but they get rid of that one. So this is going to be fascinating. So guys, every time these things happen, there's other elements of symbology going on here. So, but Wayne is far more adept at this stuff than I am in terms of this particular subject. So I'm going to hand it over to Wayne to get us going.
All right, man. So you mentioned Earth, Wind, and Fire, and it's not a coincidence that that was a very popular band back in the 1970s and 80s. So we have all of that too. They always like to put their symbology out there in plain sight for people to see. So we have these 4 classical philosophical elements of fire, water, earth, and air. And of course, the 5th element that they sometimes reference and talk about is the ether. And this one has a special place and correspondence in all of this, and they try to eliminate that out of the picture because this is one of the important precepts of their control system. They don't want you to understand the notion of ether, but fire is the main primary source for a lot of what they believe in. So they believe that we have this primordial fire within us, and that constitutes creation from the standpoint of stepping down from the divine source into manifestation here. And fire is the first element that they acknowledge, and it's the primary element. And it is this that they say powers everything else. So all the rest of the other philosophical elements step in line after fire. So we have in the philosophical breakdown of this, if you just want a basic concept for looking at some of this, if you understand when they use the philosophical elements of fire and air, largely that represents spiritual components of things, and earth and water represent the physical components of things. So we have this kind of quadrivalent symbology ever present in everything they do, and the different combinations of these different elements constitute everything. And you have to think outside the box for this. Like we're not thinking in literal physical terms with some of this stuff. It's a different way of thinking. This is the way the ancient alchemists thought about it and broke things down, and it's also the way the ancient hermetic sciences have broken this down. And I think at some point we're going to have to look at some of the basics to hermetic science in order to better frame this for reference for people. But certainly we have this element of fire, and it is the calling card for many of these dark occultists who run things in this world because they consider themselves to be the philosophers of fire. And this has to do, of course, once again, with what they would term divine source. And they seem to think that they are the arbiters of this divine force. They see themselves as being semi-divine, and we've covered some of this previously because they do like to try to trace their lineage back to the line of Cain in the Bible, and these are the ones that consider themselves the philosophers of fire, and they use fire as their calling card. It's their fingerprint that they identify their operations with, and this is demonstrable if you've studied conspiracy culture for any length of time. you know that oftentimes many of these events that happen in the world end in some fiery conflagration. And there's a reason for that because they believe that this is a way of perhaps purifying the element that's there. It's a purification process. They think they're doing you a favor, much like they like to try to initiate us into their systems with traumatic real world events, these massive trauma events that they stage. Well, oftentimes there's an association of a fire that goes along with that, and you could demonstrate this all day long by looking at some of the big operations they pulled, the Oklahoma City thing, the 9/11, all of these things, and even more recently, if you look at the events that happened just a couple weeks ago, right around the turn of the new year on New Year's Day, they started out the year with some of this going on. They had in Las Vegas, they had this Tesla truck go up in flames right in front of the Trump Hotel in Las Vegas. And all of these things relate once again to that calling card because there's the fire ever present in your face. And these are the philosophers of fire. That's how they put their thumbprint on these operations. So you could know on an esoteric level that they had something to do with this, and there's something more symbolic happening there. And now, lo and behold, we see not what, less than 2 weeks later, California's burning. It's burning. And if you have pattern recognition skills, you'll recognize some of this from just previously the past couple of years. Like if you look back, was it 2021 or 2022? Australia was on fire
Mm.
with the outbreak of the whole COVID scam that they pulled on the world. And then we had, I think it was just last year, my memory on this stuff's becoming muddled because these events just keep coming one after another. We had those Lahaina fires in Hawaii where they burned the island of Hawaii and it was almost in ruins. And now the same thing's happening in California, and it seems to happen with these different patterns that repeat, and fire always seems to be a portion of that because of their belief in what the fire does. It's a sense, in a sense, it's a ritualistic type of a purification event. They think they're doing you a favor. They're burning things down to create the new. It's the whole concept of the phoenix, the rebirth out of the destruction of a thing. And of course, we could look at some of the documentation that they have about these smart city plans that they have for all of these places that seemingly seem to get hit with natural disasters very coincidentally here right along a time frame that they have planned. So there's all of that to cover with this, but essentially the fire, in essence, when they put their calling card on a thing with a fire, not only is it a fingerprint or a stamp that this is them responsible, oftentimes it's associated with this purification process, this rebirth, the phoenix as a symbol. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that, Richard.
Well, you mentioned Elon Musk there as well. The day before this Tesla blew up or caught fire outside the Trump's towers, all symbolic, obviously. He posted on X a picture of a Tesla that looked like it was about to explode. It's been designed to look that way, and he said the future is or looks like the future. And it was only a day later this thing actually explodes outside. So obviously these guys are in it. I don't know whether he's actually trying to be so obvious that people try and stop this because it's so obvious. I can't see how he would either he's mocking people and he's psychotic, or he's actually trying to go, "Oh my god, like this is I've got myself involved with something that's well above my head here." You mean who knows what's going through his artificial intelligence mind? But it's definitely there, part of it. And what you mentioned there as well about the forging. It's like forged through the flames. It seems to be a burning process. Is there the alchemical process of kind of smelting here into gold? That seems to be a part of the processor here, in terms of because it's all alchemy, isn't it? They use the understanding of how different elements are created in what process and what order, and this seems to be forged in the flames. And also another thing I noticed is obviously the first reset that we look about Gilgamesh, Noah, it was a flood. There's water. So water was the I believe it's in the alchemical principles, it's the triangle that pointing down, and the triangle pointing up is fire. So it seems to me the second type of reset here is going to be the fire element, whereas the first one was the water element. Would there be more to that than what I've just described in terms of the cyclical nature of these things?
Oh, definitely, there's more to it. This all has to do with the alchemical processes. Now, to understand alchemy a little better, let's look at a branch of alchemy that has largely been called spagyrics. And this is the process of making tinctures and stuff from plant based materials through alchemical processes. So, the first step is you actually burn the material. You burn the material and it becomes a black ash. And when it becomes a black ash, then you have to reconstitute it with water through a filtering process to extract the essence from it. And it goes through several different steps of this burning process and then the reconstitution with water. So you have the fire and the water. The fire represents the spiritual component, the water represents the physical component, and you're extracting the essence of that, which is something sublime that transcends through these different spiritual realities and through the physical reality as well. This would be on par with what you might call the etheric essence of a thing. So they
This
do
is
refer to it as the essence. So it's a whole process that repeats where you use the fire to burn it, the water to filter it out and extract the essence from it. And then you burn it again. You burn the constituent components again until you get the white powder. And there's all different colors that goes along with this. So this is like part of the purification process. So there's a whole science of alchemy that goes along with this. So essentially, when they're burning things, this is part of the first process that they call the negrito process, the blackening. And often what this is the destructive component before they could build something new. See, they want to burn down the old world order to build their new world order. So that's a lot of what this constitutes or symbolizes in that way. So I think you were about to say something, Richard, and I cut you off. Sorry about that.
No, no, no. I was jumping in. I just wanted to ask you something. Does this relate at all to what we were talking? I think it was last week in the Kabbalah with the releasing of the spark, as we correlated it across to the eternal flame, Statue of Liberty, Shekinah, this flame that's been put on Lady Diana's and John F. Kennedy's memorials to, I believe, to symbolize that their sparks of divinity have been released in whatever Kabbalistic madness that these people have done these things on. Is there an element of that death into fire? You were talking about that being kind of like the soul released. They all seem to kind of correlate, although they're slightly different versions of the same thing. Is there an element of the Kabbalah in that?
Oh, most certainly there is, because these Kabbalic principles do draw their components from some of these ancient alchemical sciences that were known in the Hermetic sciences. So you have all of this as a constituent part to that, and they do regard this divine spark within us, this essence within us, as fire. And that's what it comes from. So it comes from the divine source, and it is fire. And this preemanates everything else. So fire is the first component that comes into manifestation. And then on top of that is built the other forms in this descending process from the divine source down through the different worlds, the spiritual worlds, and into the physical world as they regard it within these various occult systems. So fire comes first. This is the primary source from which everything else flows from. So, and this is represented in reverse order in the alchemical process, because you see they'll burn something back to the black, and that's an interesting concept in and of itself. The blackening process, the negrito, the black. And when you understand a little something about our history that we've been handed and the symbolical nature of what it's representing there, you begin to see things in a whole different light. So when we're referring to the land of Egypt, this means in some translations the black or the black sands, representing this negrito process, the burning down, the source, the start point for the beginnings of civilization here. So there was something that had existed prior that was burned and into this Negrito process and has been built upon from there. So when you see reference to in things like the Bible and other places coming out of Egypt in esoteric parlance, this is all about this rebirth process. So when you begin to understand that and know the alchemical sources of this, you know that when they're talking about coming out of the land of Egypt, that's a symbolic reference. And a lot of our history is built around this concept. In fact, they've devised an entire system around Egyptology. And this is a science unto itself, where they give you interpretations of what they think. And oftentimes, if you delve deep enough into the material, you find that the interpretations they give you of the actual history there are a little bit convoluted or mixed up. So it's interesting to understand that how it all ties together. Every aspect of our culture is built upon these alchemical principles. And that's when you come to that realization, you realize just how much we've been influenced by this stuff without our realizing.
That's so interesting with the Back to Black. Who's the singer that did the album? She passed away. Can't remember. She's on drugs. She had a problem with drugs and drinking. What's her name? British singer. She had an album
Was
called
it
Back
Amy
to Black.
Winehouse? Is
Amy
that the one?
Winehouse. That's it. I wonder if
Okay.
she knew these things. It was a nod to that. I do wonder. I mean, it's not always, but Back to Black would have been it would have fit her mental state at that point. I think she knew some things anyway. That's really interesting what you say about coming out of Egypt is coming out of the black. So when we look at in terms of the 12 tribes going from Solomon's temple with Shekinah going into Egypt, was that a purifying process of all of their illnesses, their idolatry, and all of their bad, things against Yahweh, coming out, purifying in Egypt, and then coming home again? Is this all they're describing? Is that process?
Well, that could be part of it. Also, when you hear the term coming out of Egypt, this alludes back to this split in the nature of man, whereas in we are kind of halfway divine and halfway animal. So it's about your animal nature and your spiritual nature or divine nature, and your divine spiritual nature overcoming the animal portion of man. So when you're talking about coming out of Egypt, this references also this animal tendency of man, the animal instincts of man, overcoming that. And this is represented actually in what you could call occult biology, and that they represent this by the different chakra systems in the body, and the one that's the lowest is down in around the reproductive area of man, and that's why we have these animal instincts, and we have to overcome the animal self to become the elevated higher self. And they talk about this going on through the various occult teachings with the spine and spinal cord. And Manly P. Hall does a great breakdown of this, the occult anatomy of man, if you wanted to look at it. And this is what some of them actually believe. They believe that this is a reference to coming out from the animal man and becoming the higher man in essence when you're talking about coming out of Egypt. So it refers to the sacrum, Egypt. And then when you get to the higher elevation of that, eventually what happens according to their systems they believe, and this touches upon the concepts of kundalini and several other things, your spiritual forces rise up through the spinal column eventually until they get to Golgotha, the place of the skull represented in the Bible. And this is how they frame all of this stuff. So I always caution people, whether you believe any of this or not, it's irrelevant. What you need to understand is there's people in positions of power that very much believe in these things, and the things they do to act upon their beliefs will affect all of us. So, whether you believe it or not, irrelevant, but they do, and they act upon these beliefs. So, when you understand that, you know a little bit more of what's symbolized in some of these things that they put out there, especially the news stories and entertainment events that they put out for us. It affects your unconscious mind in ways that you don't realize on a conscious level. Let's put it that way, because it has to do with the ever present archetype at play.
It's so interesting, Wayne. Like when you talk about the first, it's almost like the prototype, the first of everything is always to be taken over by the second. So when you look in terms of Cain and Abel, Cain was the obviously this supposed to be this in Kabbalistic terms even is supposed to be the seed of Eve and Samael, and then obviously Adam would be Adam and Eve. Sorry, Adam, what was it? Abel would be Adam and Eve's son. That's it. So it's the first always replacing the second, or like Jacob and Esau as well, taking on the birthright of the first, if as if they weren't worthy of it, taking being passed over to the second. So when you look in this whole messianic agenda, it's about Egypt passing. They weren't worthy of the reign of that they had. That should have been passed on to Israel. And that's when, like, if you look at the Greater Israel Project, it's clearly looks like to me another map of King Sargon's um, palace, or what do you call it? His kingdom, even that's what I'm looking for. So it looks like basically the new replaces the old, the new world order. So even with Adam and Eve, Eve was the second woman because um, Lilith was the first, apparently. So Eve was the better version, but Adam hasn't had a second version. So the second version would be, and I know this is true, what the Kabbalists actually in Chabad definitely believe because it's on their website, that the first version of Adam was Adam 1.0. Adam 2.0 would be this transhumanism. So they have this kind of replacement theory going on, don't they? This second stage.
Oh, absolutely. But when you want to get to who is the second Adam, well, that would be Jesus Christ described in the Bible. So when you're talking about they're looking for this second Adam to be the product of this transhumanist notion of things, well, that in essence, by definition, is Antichrist. So you have this Antichrist spirit, Antichrist meaning alternative Christ. So we've had the fulfillment of Adam 2.0. We have this recapitulation back with God. We have this means of getting that right relation back with source. But they're trying to replace that with an alternative method to do so, a synthetic method. And of course, they're trying to replace the entire reality we live in with a synthetic reality as well, right down to where they're attempting to build a new substrate for this reality. And we would refer to that as the concept of ether, like you were talking about in the beginning here. They're trying to recapitulate some type of a synthetic form of that in order to bring about manifestation in different ways. So it's about completely upending and inverting the natural order. That's what they want to do. And it's the inversion process. And if you've listened to me for any length of time, the true definition of Satanism is the inversion process. And that's most certainly what these dark occultists at the top of the power structure want to achieve. They want to be the gods of this place in no uncertain terms, and they think they can do that through the use of advanced technologies and using these various philosophies and archetypal ideas to position things in this way, to build a whole synthetic reality for us to exist in. And this we started to allude to a little bit the last show. This is what is referred to in the Hermetic science as the world of shells, also in the Kabbalah, the world of shells. And this is what they are attempting to create. And this is form absent spirit, essentially, when you want to get to the crux of the matter. So it's all about creating this materialist paradigm where all things just relate to the physical science side of things. And that's what they're attempting to build with our modern science, with our modern scientism. They want us to think in terms that all phenomena could be explained away through some physical cause and effect sequence. So things like consciousness, they want us to believe that it is nothing more than the byproduct of the electrochemical activity of the brain and brainstem. So they want you to think in those terms. They want you to completely disregard any spiritual realms whatsoever, any spiritual ways of thinking, and think strictly in this hyper materialist way. And that's what they're trying to build. This is called the world of shells, and it is form devoid any spirit whatsoever. And that's what the whole transhumanist agenda is all about. It wants to create a synthetic artificial knockoff devoid of any true spirit or divine spark, if you will, and rule over that. It's, you see, it's just these select few dark occultists who run things at the top that want to be the controllers and the gods of that type of a realm. And they see that they could potentially do that by using some of these advanced technologies and convincing people and tricking people into adopting these different ideas in the guise that somehow or another it will benefit them. It will give them immortality and it will give them absolute control and all of the different fantasy desires of their hearts. And it's all basically eugenics. That's what it is at the core of all of it. It's a trick, it's a lie. It's the great lie from the Garden of Eden.
It's burning it down. It's Darth Vader, isn't it? He burnt in the hot lava and came back as the the cyborg version of himself in the second time round. But then you pointed this out this morning. I didn't actually know about this. Obviously, so we're talking about the fire today. We're talking about the Prometheus type fire element of this. Burning it down is the first kind of part of the process. But LA wildfires, I didn't actually know this. So LA wildfires deliberately started to turn Los Angeles even into smart city by 2028. I didn't even know they had that on the radar till you told me before we started recording. The smart city, so they're burning it down to build up their synthetic version of it.
Exactly. And this is the modus operandi you see all around with this stuff. So certainly whenever you see the element of fire wielded in this way by these dark occultists and these controllers that run things in this world, you know that there's some type of a rebuilding effort that has been planned there. That is their modus operandi. That is their motto: order out of chaos. They want to build the new world order out of the chaos created by the burning fire in the form of the phoenix. It's the rebirth process. And this is how they get things done. And it's based upon some of these old occult principles and alchemical principles. And they've misused them and misapplied them. It's the abuse of these principles because you see, some of these things, they do have natural elements to them. And that's the important thing to understand. And of course, they always link this back to this Antichrist notion. They want people to adopt this alternative Christ principle. And certainly, this is connected in this way to the element of fire. Well, if you go back in the Bible story, when the crucifixion took place, they wrote on the top of the cross the word INRI. It's an abbreviation, INRI. And this, in the translation given by the Bible, is said to represent Iesus Nazarenus Rex Ierdium, which means Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. Well, when you learn that there's an occult principle tied to that phrase INRI and it has a completely different meaning and context, then you could begin to make the connections here, connect the dots in your head. INRI actually means, according to the occultists and the secret society groups and the people who look for the esoteric meanings of things, INRI means ignis natura renovator integram, which means fire unceasingly renews nature, or all nature is perfectly renewed through fire. So this is the important concept, and it is an alchemical principle. And it is a principle, if you go into land management and stuff like this, they know that if you actually burn the land where the crops were produced every couple of years, you'll get better yields in upcoming years. And we see this in real world events too, where you have massive growth potential after a major fire. So it is a type of naturalistic principle when it comes down to stuff like that with vegetation and stuff like that. Things will grow back with renewed vigor after they've been cleansed with the fire. This is the purification process. But this is what this means to these philosophers of fire. So when they're burning this down, they plan on building it back better than it was before. And this is based on their abuse and inversion of the natural principle here. So when you burn the land after so many seasons of growing crops on it and you leave it empty and not cultivated for like a year or something like that after you burn it, then when you come back to grow new crops there, you have a lot better production. This is a known thing by a lot of people who practice these things. So that's that principle that's based upon. So when they burn something like that, they want to leave it sit untouched for a portion of time. And then in another season, they will get renewed growth out of it. And this is how they see it. They see it as the renewal process through fire. And they tie this right back to that Antichrist principle that I was mentioning earlier. So they're trying to attach this archetype and leverage this idea in that way when you look at the occult concept behind it. And it is, like I said, it's their thumbprint that they put on everything, the fire.
It's incredible to think that they've got the Olympics, I believe, coming up. This is what Gavin Newsom apparently had to say today or yesterday evening, depending where you are. I was just talking to Josh Green, the governor down in Hawaii, who had some ideas around some land use concerns he has around speculators coming in and buying up properties. That's in Hawaii. So we're already working with our legal teams to move those things forward, and we'll be presenting those in a matter of days. So basically, he's not waiting around for the next season. He's not even waiting around for the next week, by the looks of it. And this is to, well, obviously goes into the smart city. So, as Los Angeles battles for 5 wildfires, a conspiracy theory claims they were started. Well, we've seen people walking around starting them from for the Smart LA 2028 project. Social media posts link the fires to arson, with one suspect arrested in the Palisades, facing life imprisonment if convicted. So they've arrested people they're agreeing it looks like it's started by people, but the Smart LA thing is just like, I mean, do you think people just it's too in your face for people to accept that it's real?
They love to do that, don't they? Yet people will look at it and it's a coincidence. I'm sorry, I don't have enough faith to be a coincidence theorist. There's just too much of this stuff goes on all the time. This is what I tell people, like, how much more blatant do they have to be with it before you can admit to yourself and stop denying the fact that there is a connection between these things? It defies statistical probability. I would really love to get a statistician or somebody like that who can actually sit and figure this out, to figure out what's the probability that all this came about by coincidence, that all this planning, this pre-planning of this stuff was put out there years ago, and now all of a sudden things are falling in place just how they were according to their models that they predicted and everything else, in order to bring about these changes that they want. And we've seen this over and over again. I mean, you could use the whole COVID scam as an example of this. There's just so many things that fall into place with that are actually now coming to the surface in the mainstream media now, that those of us who knew about it were talking about years ago and being censored for. But like, all this stuff's being admitted to now. So how much of this do you need to see before you could admit to yourself it's more than a coincidence that this stuff happens? I mean, natural disasters and stuff, yeah, they do happen. Don't get me wrong. But what's the chances that it would happen just in the exact area, according to the exact timing that they had planned out 4 years ago? Think about it. What's the chances? It defies statistical probability. And especially when you learn to read the language of symbology with this, you know there's something more at play. And they love to use that way of communicating. This is, like we talked about, part of the synchromystic metadata that's out there that they use as a method of communication and the imparting of ideas with each other. It's out there. You can see it, you can connect the dots, and you understand that it goes beyond statistical probability, that these things are signaled out there in the ether for us to see. But they have this whole backdoor program built into it that's called plausible deniability. That way they could come back and say, well, that's just ridiculous. You're a tinfoil hat nutter if you believe that. How can we do something like that? How can we plan all of this stuff in this way? Like, how could you even think that? It's called plausible deniability. They love to use that as a means of trying to save face with this stuff, to try to disprove any pre-planning element to this stuff. So they'll say stuff like that. They'll claim you're a nut if you believe any of that stuff, because how could we pull that off? How can we do that? Well, that's what we're trying to break down here. How do they do these things? And it has to do with this programming archetype, this synchromystic metadata, where these things wind up out there in the ether. And like we've tried to explain previously, I do think that there's a beyond human intelligence that goes into guiding and directing that and putting this information out there in the ether. And it's all part of this whole concept that I call metaphysical consent, because they have to have your consent in order to pull off a stunt like this. And they view your tacit consent as not rejecting or objecting to the information they're giving you there, whether that be in the form of an entertainment program like a movie or The Simpsons or some such thing as an archetype to carry forward the idea. If you don't object to that, they see that as your tacit consent for it, and they will proceed accordingly in that way. So you have this metaphysical consent angle of all of it that gets put out there. And it's really kind of devious when it gets down to it. But this is how they get it done. They affect the human mind with the synchromystic metadata cues out there to accept whatever it is that they plan on doing. And like I said, I think there's a beyond human intelligence that goes into guiding and directing a lot of this too. It's not all human planning. And that's the element that people can't wrap their heads around. And that's why they could come back with this plausible deniability, because they want you to believe that it's only the physical world. That's all there is. There's no other elements to this. And if they could get you to believe that, then they got you right where they want you. And then their plausible deniability works. Well, we couldn't possibly do that. No, you couldn't, not without some kind of an outside spiritual force guiding and directing things. And that's what they rely upon. And these dark occultists who run things, they understand that spiritual component side of it, but they want you to be wholly ignorant of it. They don't want you to believe it at all, because they want to actually build this world of shells that we had talked about here previous. That's what the whole transhumanist notion is all about.
What's really fascinating as well is that only, was it 2 months ago? I believe, yeah, it was December, so not even 2 months ago. Um, one of the supposedly Rothschilds' mansions or homes burnt down in Laurel Canyon. Now, anyone knows about anything about Laurel Canyon would know that that's where a lot of the hippie kind of MK Ultra stuff went on, and there's also Lookout Mountain there, where they seem to have processed a lot of footage from the New Mexico bomb tests, atomic bomb test sites. I think they are opening up portals there. There's lots going on in New Mexico that's going on underground, as we know. But he just suddenly house burnt down. Now, there's people saying that he wasn't a Rothschild, but this is really interesting. What I found out is a reclusive man who died in LA fire. So it was just a random fire, and he burnt his house down. Claimed to be member of the wildly wealthy Rothschild family, but was he? An 87-year-old man who was known as William de Rothschild was found dead in his burned Laurel Canyon home on the 28th of November. The Los Angeles Times, LA again, reported. In the days following, however, the newspaper discovered he was not born with the surname and does not appear in the Rothschild's family tree. Well, that doesn't really mean anything. That's when the Times discovered he changed his name to Rothschild. So this could either be a cover up of him actually being a Rothschild. There's fire elements in there. Make of it what you will. Come to your own conclusions. But his actual name apparently was, court records reveal that a man in Los Angeles County named William Alfred Kaufman. Andy Kaufman. Anyone knows about Andy Kaufman will know that he was a master at pretending he was other people. Now, I think this is how they signal to each other. What do you make of that bit of information?
That's interesting. I hadn't heard about that until just now, but that is kind of how they operate in many ways. So maybe it is a cover for something else, or maybe there's nothing to it whatsoever. It's hard to tell, but they do operate in those type of ways. They like to use the connect the dots type of way of thinking, like you just did, to communicate an idea so that you could know something. Another good example of a very similar type thing is, remember back to the beginning phases of the COVID scam they pulled on the world. And when they first introduced the vaccine to the world, well, who was the very first recipient of the COVID vaccine? William Shakespeare.
It's
Really?
absurd, isn't it?
It really is absurd when you think about it, but I kid you not, that's what it is. So they like to throw this stuff in your face and see if you actually bite on it and believe it. And sadly enough people do believe it, and they just go about with this stuff itself. So what are they telling you there by having the first recipient of the COVID vaccination being named William Shakespeare? Well, they're telling you in no uncertain terms, if you could connect the esoteric dots, that all the world is a stage.
Mm.
And I think you could understand from there where the rest of that goes. So, at any rate, that's one example of how they do things in this esoteric way. And most people don't pick up on it because they've just been so indoctrinated and mind control programmed by their television sets that they just can't see the world and the cues that they tell you for what it is. And they put it out there in plain sight so that if you do have eyes to see, you know it's a work. Let's put it that way. You know the whole thing's a work. But those who can't see through that, well, they get what they deserve in the eyes of these controllers of this place, don't they?
It's so absurd. That it's ridiculous. I don't know if I've got my mic on mute or not. Is it muted? No, thank God. Because I was just trying to find something that backed up what you said, but I can't find it. I've only heard it from one or two sources that the first persons get this H1B or HB1. H1B virus over here was called someone gulling, which made me laugh. So obviously
It's
it's
called
bird
what?
flu. Someone gulling or goose, it's some goose related surname, and obviously it's bird flu type strain. So I think that that was something along those lines as well. Maybe that was a joke, and I can't find it now. But yes, William Shakespeare. I mean, come on, it's just old Bill Shakespeare is just ridiculous. And they're laughing at you, but also it's so absurd. There is make the lies big, and people won't believe them. And what has this got to do then when in terms of, so this is a process. So we had the fires burnt it down, comes out of the black smoke, it's coming out of Egypt. What would you see to be happening next in LA? Obviously, they're moving towards this 2028 smart city. In terms of the process of what you know in this alchemical processes, what we're trying to show that they stick to these things. What would be the next part of the process, do you think?
Well, it would be the filtering out process. It would be the reconstituting with the element of water in filtering out the essence of what LA is. And what is the essence of LA? Well, what is LA known for? It's probably one of the most sinful cities on earth. And we have Hollywood there and all of these things that are used as a means of controlling the minds of the masses. So they're probably trying to distill the essence of that into their new creation, but it's going to be an elevated form of the old thing. So it's going to still have some of the same components and elements present there that they use, but on a grander scale with a more precise control mechanism. So essentially, they want to build this new city, this smart city, and they plan on having it done by 2028 in time for the Olympic Games, which are held there. And of course, the element of fire is ever present at the Olympic Games as well, isn't it? We have the torch that's carried in the Olympics, and we have all the symbolism and symbology present with the Olympics. And in fact, these people who run things in this world, these dark occultists and their minions, the technocrats, there's a small group of them that call themselves the Olympians, and they think that they are the gods of this place, and they want to rebuild in accordance with what it is that they desire for this world. And they will do so with these smart city programs that they've implemented across the board in various places throughout the world. And in that document that talks about the smart city, LA as a smart city, there's a little snippet from it I'll read to you.
Mhm.
Los Angeles is a founding member of the World Council on City Data. The World Council on City Data and its development of global standards for city data enables cities to use data to design and measure the performance of city services and the quality of life impacts on its communities. As a founding city and platinum certified member, the city of Los Angeles serves as one of the leaders to set the global agenda for standardized city data, identifying strategic trends for cities and defining a framework for standardized urban metrics. That's directly from that document. So this is a model. It's a test run in LA. for what they want to do with the rest of the world. They want to set up this standards of data collection. So you know what this ties to. This ties into the digitization of everything. This metric system where they want to acquire all of your data, whether it be biometric or your financial data, everything they know about you, even your medical records. They want to put that in a centralized data utility. And of course, this includes the much hyped and talked about social credit score, which many people don't want to acknowledge, but it has been actively rolled out in portions of China and is being ported over to the Western cultures right now. And the infrastructure for it's already in place. And most people don't realize it. They just haven't gone completely active with it yet. But of course, this ties to things like universal basic income and the digitization of currency into a complete digital system where they don't want any actual physical currency to exist. They want it all to be a digital money system. And that way they have total and absolute control. And Los Angeles is one of the models for rolling out the data collection infrastructure for this. So, a lot of big things on the horizon here.
There really are, and then it's so fascinating to look at the kind of the esoteric side of things as well as how it relates to like things like universal basic income. Because people wouldn't think they ever connect, but they do. You mentioned the so the Olympians earlier. So people don't know, the Titans and the Olympians were basically foes who would be pitted against each other. So in Greek mythology, the Titans and the Olympians were two generations of gods who fought in a war to determine which generation would rule the universe. So this is what they're invoking, I believe. So when you look at one of the Titans, that was Prometheus. Now, he was the god of fire. Prometheus is best known for defying the Olympian gods, by taking fire from them and giving it to humanity. So it's very similar kind of concept to the snake in the Garden of Eden, giving knowledge to humanity when they weren't ready for it. They're invoking all of these things. So do you think these guys believe they are the Olympians
Oh, they most certainly do.
taking the fire from taking fire from Prometheus and the Titans and humans, so that we're, they could see us as the Titans and they're the Olympians, and they're taking the fire that was given to us, which we shouldn't have got hold of, like the knowledge.
Well, the way they view it, this is the same archetype that's present for Lucifer as well. The fire bringer, the light bringer, if you want to call it that. And this goes back to the allegory, yeah, of the Luciferian doctrine or the Luciferian philosophy, where they believe that man was held prisoner in the Garden of Eden by a cruel and unjust and vindictive God. And Lucifer, through bringing us the fire in the form of the Prometheus myth, the fire representing intellect, primordial intellect, by giving that to man, freed us from our chains of bondage. And this is how they view things, through that lens of observation. So these Olympians who have taken hold of the flame, it's an old Queensryche song, by the way, Take Hold of the Flame.
Oh, okay.
They took hold of the flame, and they see that as representative of intellect, that man through his intellect can become God. And that's what they teach and what they believe at the core. And they are firmly involved in trying to ensconce themselves in that type of control in this world. They want to be the gods of this place in no uncertain terms. And it's a very small group of these people at the top who think they could do that. And sometimes there's infighting at the topmost levels as to who gets to hold the title of Lucifer at the end of the day. And that's essentially what I think is going on with this whole transhumanist push for things. And if you look at the esoteric philosophies and the symbolism of fire involved, well, you begin to understand a little better, because this is what their foundational and core belief systems talk about. This fire, when you understand fire, represents something completely different than the actual physical thing that we see as fire. It represents intellect, intelligence, in their view, reason, logic. And this is in contradiction to the emotional side of man, the animalistic side. This is about the elevation of man to that point of becoming godlike. and casting aside our animal nature or the emotional nature. And then you have the archetype of something like Mr. Spock in the old Star Trek TV show, the original. Mr. Spock, pure logic and reason being the elevated standard there, casting aside the emotional side of things and putting aside morals and ethics. And this is where we get into some dangerous territory because it is about moral relativism. It's about justification of what they want to do with their own will. And will is an important concept to these people, to these dark occultists. The will is one of the prime concerns of these dark magicians and dark occultists. They want to kind of invoke their will into what they want in this world. It's about advancing their own interests at the expense of others, because that's one of the primary resources of the magician is their will, and it's one of their primary focuses. So, and this has to do with this godlike nature that they want to try to instantiate themselves into. So that's one of the things that they operate on. So I hope I didn't lose people there. There's a lot of different components to this that cross the board. So when you understand some of these, it's gives you a clearer picture of what's going on with these people in power.
It really is, and yeah, it was interesting when you talked about them infighting. So you would have a group, for example, say, and I love rolling these things past you, like an example, like the Chabad guys that we spoke about last week with this messianic agenda that draws upon the Old Testament, the New Testament, and this Israel first kind of, messianic new world. But then there's the Titans, that sort of group, sorry, the Olympians wouldn't really necessarily go along with them, the messianic guys ruling the earth. So there's got to be a point at the end there that even those would collapse in on itself because there's factions there, as you say. The only thing they
Yeah.
have in common is they don't want us to have any of it, but they will fight over the scraps once they've destroyed it all with fire. Apparently.
A lot of this has to do with their core belief systems too, because you see all of these dark occultists, not all of them agree on certain different contentions as far as the foundations of our culture and our civilization go. Now, there are some that will look into the biblical context and the Hebrew history and stuff like that as the foundation for our modern culture. And then there's the other side that views the Greek side of things as the foundations of our modern culture. And the ideas and archetypes they invoke come from these different systems. And that's why we see such crossover with this stuff. So when you understand that, they view these different concepts or mythological archetypes from a system they're familiar with, and they apply the principles from a system they're familiar with, or that they agree with or think is more correct than the other, then you can see how they cross the board with a lot of these things. So you have those that attach to these old Kabbalistic traditions that come out of Judaism, and then you have those that attach themselves to the Greek philosophies, but it also has these same Kabbalic principles invoking in there as well. But it's just a matter of what is the system language, if you will, that they're using. And this is an important concept that I just touched upon very recently as well. They tell you oftentimes in big events what the system language is that they're using to communicate ideas, because they have to have a firm grasp of a lot of these different mythological archetypes. This old classical education we don't receive in the public school system anymore, where you're familiar with the old myths, you're familiar with the old stories, you're familiar with the works of the likes of Virgil or the likes of Plato and stuff like that. We're not taught that stuff anymore. So when you understand the myth representation that's being presented in the form of a symbol out there in the public discourse and language in the news media and the entertainment media, then you could begin to maybe pick up what it is they're trying to reference. Because a different symbol could mean many different things. One single symbol could represent many different things. And if you don't know the context that's being presented or the intention, then you lose the whole point of the symbol. And a lot of people will misinterpret symbols and come up with grandiose ideas about what the symbol represents, and it'll completely be wrong from what the intention and the context of the symbol is. That's why it's important that you have a basis in these things. So a lot of them like to use Greek myth or the Romanized version of Greek myth as a programming archetype. And a lot of them like to use these more traditional Jewish or Judeo Christian ideas as a programming template. So they put it out there, and oftentimes they'll give you some of the cues in some major events that are going on. And we just saw something similar to this going on. So I'm referring, of course, to the events that happened on New Year's Day. Of course, there was this terrorist attack in New Orleans, where this guy ran a truck through a crowd of
Mm.
people and had all kinds of bombs and stuff like that. And the story changes all the time with that. And then simultaneously, also, you had the explosion of that Tesla Cybertruck in front of Trump's hotel in Las Vegas. So we had the queue up there, and they were telling us the system language that they're using here for the bulk of this year. And you could look at Middle Eastern type cultures, you could look at the Judaic or Kabbalistic interpretation, as well as Egyptian symbology to be used as a template this year. So when you could apply those lenses of observation to the symbols you see out there in this year, you can maybe make some more accurate predictions about things. Now, the next big event that they have coming up that all eyes will be on here in America will be the Super Bowl, the big football game, the superb owl, if you will. And I'm expecting to see a lot of Egyptian iconography and stuff like that crop up at the halftime show and in the commercials and everything else that they use to celebrate this major event. And I wouldn't be surprised there's probably going to be some kind of Hollywood tribute and stuff like this due to the fires that have come about. And we'll see all the programming archetypes going on, but they will have this kind of Middle Eastern traditional Egyptian iconography and stuff like that going on with it. So that's what I'm expecting, just based upon the things that I've seen. And of course, they reserve the right to be totally wrong on all of that. But it seems pretty obvious to me when they have a major event on New Year's Day, multiple major events that point to the same type of reference point. They're telling you a little something. They're telling you this is the programming language we're using this year. Yes, the Super Bowl, I would expect to see a lot of like Egyptian iconography or some type of old Hebraic iconography or even Persian iconography, something Middle Eastern, like Middle Eastern cultures. They'll use that type of a template for the symbology that they're presenting there. So you could use that to try to read into what the symbol is supposed to represent. And a lot of people will probably misinterpret the symbols that are being put out there and apply totally wrong designations to it. So this is how they do things. They'll first of all they'll tell you, okay, this is the system language we're using to communicate in this upcoming year. They like to use New Year's Day as a method of telling each other this is what we're looking for, because they do have these diverse belief systems at the topmost levels of the power structure with these dark occultists who run things. Like I said, some of them like to use like the Greco-Roman mythology as a programming template. Some of them like to use other more obscure things, and some of them really like to use like the old Persian and Egyptian, Middle Eastern type cultures for the displaying of their symbols and the meaning behind them. So this is what they like to do. They use big events and certain times of the year, cycles of time, to introduce the new programming language. So essentially, that's my breakdown of what goes on. They will introduce this programming language, this system language that they're going to use, and then when you see the symbols out there being represented, you know how to translate those symbols into what the meaning is by looking at that modology or modality, excuse me, of mythology. So when you go back and you see all of this Egyptian iconography popping up, you know to interpret it through the Egyptian meaning rather than like use a Greek meaning or something like that.
Mm.
if you understand what I'm saying here, because they like I said, symbols have multiple different usages. They can have multiple meanings to them, and if you don't know the context to how it's presented and the intention, then you're missing it. And that's the key to reading symbols is you have to first of all you have to know the intention behind the symbol, and second of all you have to know the context behind the symbol in order to get an accurate description. Now, if you know one or the other, you might be able to get a partial read on what the symbol's supposed to mean. Like if you understand the intention behind it, but not the context, then you might be able to read a little bit into it. And if you know the context of it, but without the intention, you get part of the picture too. But in order to get the whole picture, you need both of those things. And this is all stuff I've been trying to express to people for a long time now because it's very hard to actually describe in words what exactly you're looking for. It's something that you pick up as a skill over the course of time from looking at these things. So I'm just trying to help people to clue them in as to how this stuff seems to work with this programming language they use, this synchromystic metadata, if you want to call it that.
It's so difficult to know. It's like putting on a different pair of glasses for each different understanding. It's like having 20 different pairs of glasses that you need to put on to be able to see it and knowing which to put on when. And that's the real art of reading this, the real skill that only comes with over time. Like you have, just for example, you have the Chabad guys very heavily involved with the guys in Washington, D.C. Washington, D.C. is absolutely covered in Roman architecture. In is Washington was Rome, Maryland once. You get the Seven Hills of Saturn there, so everything is kind of mixed in together, and that does get really confusing for people, and that's totally understandable. And I'm not, I mean, that confuses me, and a part of the confusion is to be there on purpose, and it is to lead you on to say you get the truth at the next level, you get the truth at the next level. Half of those people are confused as well, so it almost seems like there's very few people that really do understand what's going on here or why it's going there, but the themes are the same. They want to reset this world and control it. They're the two that you really need to kind of grasp onto, which are quite obvious ones. Now, how and for what reason and what god and what symbology, it seems to be all different, but it seems to me that would be a fail-safe because in the end, they're going to end up destroying each other because you've got a bunch of criminals going around the world, killing people, genociding people, causing all sorts of hassle, and none of them can trust each other either. So I think that's worth mentioning at the end is that they are completely riddled with the same cancer that they're trying to spread out on the world because none of them can get the job done because they're all backstabbing each other. So it's got a fail safe in it. It's just I think like people like me and Wayne, we try and that bit of damage limitation before they get too far in this. But yeah, I'll leave you with the last words. But this has been fascinating about the fire. So when you're seeing the fires taking over now, you know this is the start of a alchemical process of burn it to the ground, then the black smoke coming out of Egypt, and then the purification through water into what's going to be new. And this is a process. They understand the nature of reality, and I think that's something that we all could understand and we all should be given. And it's fascinating to me, and it is the way of the world, isn't it?
Absolutely. And this is the thing. I mean, evil will even cannibalize itself. Evil always even destroys itself. And that's what's going to happen eventually with these people. But they seem to think in their hubris that they could overcome those obstacles and become the gods of this place before that happens. And that's what they always try to do. So we have this year starting out with fire. And of course, they've predicted 2025 is a big year for a lot of change to come in this world. They've used it as a timeline, and they're behind schedule with a lot of the things they wanted to do. So it to me, it seems to symbolize all of these fires in the beginning portion of the year. They want to close out a lot of things by the end of the year. They want to create a lot of new systems by the end of this year. So they're working at a frantic pace to get this stuff done, and of course, we're going to see things escalate over the course of the next several months. But it's all about with these people, they like to use their different programming narratives and archetypes to affect the human mind in different ways. And they communicate these systems secretly with each other. And like we were just alluding to, it's difficult to translate. It still confuses me. I'm only in the beginning phases of trying to unpack a lot of this and make it understandable to people. But it seems to me they like to use these different ways to signal to each other, okay, this is what we hope to achieve in the upcoming months with these certain agendas, and they'll reference back to their mythological stories or their old stories for you to interpret the symbols as to what they mean. And like you said, the big picture is largely it's transformational. They want to take over, they want to build their new world order, but you can get a little bit more context clues and more specific details by learning to read this system language that they put out in the form of this synchromystic metadata. And connecting the dots becomes difficult if you don't have a broad education in some of these old mythological allegories and different systems. So you have to have a large, broad base of knowledge that's born in the classical education system that we used to have, where you're taught about the myths of Greece, the myths of Rome, the myths of Norse mythology, Egyptian, all of these different systems, even the Chinese or the Eastern cultures, which, by the way, they used as a programming motif in the year 2023. I've actually done some broadcasts about that. And of course, many of the things that I had said about that had actually come to fruition. Not to toot my own horn, I really don't take any pleasure in being right about some of these things for sure. In fact, I wish I was wrong on a lot of it. So, like, you could see how they'll switch up the motif for whatever seems to further their agenda at the time. And they've done the same thing here. So they've switched back to this Egyptian type iconography. I say Egyptian because that's one of the classic mythologies that they like to use as a programming motif. It'll be Middle Eastern in general, but probably more specifically Egyptian in what we see coming up. So we'll probably see a lot of Egyptian iconography this year attached to different things. And if you know the myths of ancient Egypt, then maybe you could imply certain meanings to events that happen in that way. So, of course, we have California on fire. It's burning right now, and it's the hallmark of the philosophers of fire. They want to burn it to the ground and build something new there, their new world order. And we see the actual documentation of this LA Smart City 2028 just in time for the Olympic Games, another big event on the world stage. So, anyway, I know it's a lot to put together, and we can't possibly cover all of this in one short episode. So, maybe we'll just leave it there. Richard, do you have any closing remarks for all of this?
Oh, I just think go ahead and do your own research. Make sure you come to your own conclusions. And what we're trying to do, as you say, we're trying to learn the stuff as we go through and kind of decipher what they're doing along with you guys. You're on a journey with us. So just before we go, you can see any of my other work on iconic.com and richard.willett at Substack. And where can they find you and your work, Wayne, when we're not together doing these shows?
www.alchemicaltechrevolution.com. It's my website. Everything's centralized there. You can find all of my work there. So thank you everyone for tuning in. Richard and I are thrilled that this program has had the reception that it's had so far, and we're looking forward to doing more of this in the very near future.
Yeah, thank you guys for joining us, and we'll see you in a couple of weeks' time. Please do share the podcast and the video version, subscribe, and also leave us some ratings and comments as well. It helps push the show up. This information is the deciphering of how these lunatics think. So it's been an honor and a pleasure, Wayne, again to join you for episode 3.
All right, my man. Have a good day now.
Bye.